Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love.
Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm political scientist Michael Baranowski, an emeritus professor at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson.
Hey, good morning, Mike.
Hey, Jay, how are you doing this morning?
Well, I'll tell you, I'm getting tired of all the winning, as he predicted.
So much winning. Well, let's get right to it and talk about that so-called winning. And obviously, we're going to open with the U.S. and Iran signing that memorandum of understanding to end the war started on February 28th. And of course, it's just a framework, not a final settlement. And, well, it does a lot of things, or claims to do a lot of things, declares a permanent end to the fighting on all fronts, including Lebanon. More on that later. Reopens the Strait of Hormuz toll-free for 60 days, lifts the U.S. naval blockade, waives oil sanctions on Iran immediately so they can sell oil, commits the U.S. and regional partners to at least $300 billion in reconstruction for Iran, and unfreezes Iranian assets. Now, on the nuclear question, it does far less. Iran did restate that it will not build a nuclear weapon, and the two sides agree only to negotiate the fate of its enriched uranium over the next 60 days. So these hard questions about things like verification, enrichment, the stockpile, these are pushed off to that final deal that doesn't yet exist. Now, the administration is painting this as a win that potentially rewards Iranian good conduct and ends an unpopular and costly war while still keeping U.S. leverage in reserve. But a significant number of people, including plenty of Republicans, are calling it a capitulation that actually leaves Iran better off than before the war started in some ways. And Israel certainly is not happy at all, saying that Tehran conceded nothing of substance here. And at the G7 this week, Trump said to the Iranians, "We're dealing with people that I think are very rational people, and they were nice to deal with. They were strong people, smart people. They're not radicalized, and they're, looking to help their country." And of course, problems have already emerged in the form of continued fighting between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. And while an immediate and permanent end to the fighting on all fronts is one of the key parts of this deal, neither Israel nor Lebanon was part of these negotiations, and neither one is a signatory to this memorandum of understanding. So, Jay, before we get to winners and losers, which of course has been the focus of pretty much most of the coverage, I thought it maybe makes sense to start with talking about what we actually see the MOU as being designed to do. And then based on that, we can talk about winners and losers and so forth. So to start with that, what do you see as the purpose of this document?
So Mike, first of all, I do want to say if the Iranians say they're not going to build a nuclear weapon, well, that's good enough for me.
There you go. What else do you need? Yeah.
The other thing, and I think maybe we can, I'm the answer I was going to give is the entire purpose of this agreement is to open the Strait of Hormuz. And I think we can maybe give listeners a glimpse behind the curtain of what happened. We actually recorded this segment earlier and then had a technical glitch and lost it. So now we have to re-record it. And Mike, you probably haven't seen this yet, but we started re-recording at about 10:30. At 10:28, I just got an update on my phone with the Wall Street Journal article that says Iran closes Strait of Hormuz as fighting flares again in Lebanon.
There you go.
So I think I want to say, one, people didn't get to listen to the original segment, but I predicted in the original segment this would fall apart.
Brilliant.
I didn't predict that it would fall apart within half an hour of saying that. But, going back, no, it looks like the entire point of this agreement was to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. It looks like, as of at least 5 minutes ago, that's not the situation, but we'll see, because this is a obviously ever-evolving story. And also, I think Trump acknowledged as much, saying that that's the reason for doing this, because he sort of feared a, global depression if the Strait of Hormuz stayed closed, and which to me seems to sort of, I don't know, I think it was sort of maybe some other choices. It's not necessarily a binary agree to this deal or a worldwide depression, but there we have it. And so it looks like we may be on plan B or plan C at this point, if the Iranians are actually now saying it's closed again.
Yeah, it's hardly surprising to me as well. And I agree with you in terms of the intent of this, especially given the fact that oil reserves that various countries had were dwindling quite a lot. This really put a lot of pressure on President Trump with the midterms coming up. And, you don't necessarily want a serious depression or recession when you're going into midterms that you're already.
Well, I don't even know. I doubt a serious depression or recession, but you don't want high gas prices.
Exactly. Yeah. There you go. Yeah. Exactly. But in terms of, before we get to the other parts of the deal, I think the reason why neither of us find this very surprising is when we think about the incentive structure for Netanyahu and Israel. Well, they started out being all in for regime change, understandably so, because certainly Iran wants regime change in Israel and has for, the entire existence of Israel. And so now, with Trump saying things like, I don't see what's wrong with Iran having missiles because, other countries have missiles. Why shouldn't they? I'm Israel. I'm Netanyahu saying, what? Well, what are you saying here? And so it makes sense to me. The Netanyahu is fighting for his political life and potentially for his freedom at some point in their fall elections, with something like 70% of Jewish Israelis supporting intensifying the fight against Hezbollah. Well, they have every reason to push back against this and to make sure this deal falls apart. I mean, to give you a sense, just a few days ago, the National Security Minister of Israel said, for every tear shed by an Israeli mother, 1,000 Lebanese mothers should cry. All of Lebanon should burn. That's a pretty strong statement. And so, I mean, we're clearly on that's what I'm saying is Israel has a weird amount of leverage at this particular point in time, I think. Well, what's your take on that?
So I think let me back up. And it's a little strange having just done this a minute ago, and now again with what I'm trying to process with the
Did I say this before, or am I saying it again? No, I totally understand.
The current facts. I think the Israelis have every right to be worried. My prediction of 45 minutes ago was that Iran, either directly or through its proxies, would continue to wage war on Israel, because that's what Iran does, and that's what Iran has been doing for the last 45 years, and that this would blow up this deal at some point. And, we're left then, Trump is left with the choices of bad or worse. One might say that choice is already put to him of resuming hostilities in order to reopen the strait, or living with what is sort of a bad deal seen by certainly all the Democrats were going to say it's a bad deal, but a significant number of members of his own party, as well as our most important strategic ally in the region, see this as a very bad deal.
And I guess, a lot of outlets are pointing out that when this war started, President Trump said, all I will accept is unconditional surrender. And he said, all I care about is the freedom of the Iranian people. And he said, all I want is freedom for the people. So there are a couple ways to look at this, I suppose, because he's clearly just done a 180 on those things, right? I mean, the MOU specifically rules out regime change by saying we want to get involved in the internal politics. Well, that probably means not killing top leaders, you would assume. And it's certainly true to say that Donald Trump said things and now he has gone back on them. That's just on the record.
There are a lot of conditions on this surrender.
Yeah, but I will say this. One way you could argue this is saying that this is part of sort of a Trumpian approach to everything. You go in to a negotiation making wild, crazy, unreasonable demands to sort of set your marker there and work downward from there. I'm not saying that that's what he's doing necessarily, but I'm saying that's not a completely wild way to look at it, given Donald Trump's history of making crazy, outrageous demands to kind of set that, to set that negotiating point and then work from that standpoint.
Well, I think that's sort of exactly right. Again, not getting into the psychoanalysis of Donald Trump. I think we're just looking at his history and how he's handled a whole lot of other deals, and if you read his book, The Art of the Deal, it sort of recommends exactly that, right? That's how he negotiates. That's how he sees things going. The problem is it's one thing to make a deal when it's you and your company. It's something else when you've got a whole lot of other stakeholders in the deal. And I think that's a big difference, because if it is just you making the deal, well, you can always change your mind and accept a little less. But if you're asking other people to expend political capital, military capital, and actual lives fighting this, that's a much bigger ask, and you have to be able to, backing off that quickly sends the message that you're perhaps not to be trusted next time.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it seems to me that...
Or worse yet, maybe let's put it this way. It sends the message that you are, in essence, bluffing.
Yeah. And that once you lose a certain amount of credibility, then that makes it, you can only go to that well so many times, I think, and it seems to me increasingly that Trump is in a rough position because let's say that we don't have an agreement at the end of 60 days. I feel there's a very high probability of that.
Well, I think we might not have an agreement as of this morning now,
exactly.
But yeah.
But I mean, it's every day that goes by makes it more difficult politically for President Trump to resume the blockade of the Strait and to resume bombing because the political costs, maybe we don't end up with a worldwide depression, but if we end up with gas prices, $4.10, $4.20, $4.40 a gallon as we're going into midterms, that's definitely not good for Donald Trump.
Right. And this sort of goes back to what I said a minute ago. I think I can see him taking more military action, restarting hostilities within 60 days, if not earlier. Because he sort of has his options are bad and worse, right? I think as you say, resuming hostilities is bad. Worse is being made to look impotent in the face of Iran. Trump can't bear being seen as a loser, and if you've got members of your own party who are essentially saying that going into the midterms, I think that's almost a bigger problem for him than having high gas prices. I think it's better to be seen doing something and saying, okay, look, I'm doing something and gas prices are high, but we're going to get through this, as opposed to being seen as capitulating.
Well, I've observed, and this is not an original observation with me, is that as far as Donald Trump is concerned, and many of his most ardent followers, that Donald Trump can never fail, but he can be failed by incompetent or, mendacious underlings, that sort of thing. And now it seems to me that in this sense, he's already trying to set up, or maybe J.D. Vance is, for various reasons we can get into, is allowing himself to be set up for this. I mean, in fact, at the G7 this week, you said, if it works out, I'll take the credit. If it doesn't, I'm blaming J.D., who weirdly was a signatory to that MOU, which, I mean, you don't need the vice president's signature.
We like the vice president to sign. Who?
Yeah, exactly. But, and you even,
official.
Already we have people, Ben Shapiro this week said, the Vice President of the United States, the chief negotiator on this particular project, has not well served the president. So, I mean, already we kind of see this happening, right? And I think Donald Trump, what's most important for him, even if there are electoral losses, he can just say that's rigged. But that personal responsibility, that can never be his. That can be Vance's. And I think Vance has sort of tried to step up and make the bet, hoping that this will work out and he'll be able to kind of ride those coattails in 2028.
High risk, high reward. Yeah.
But I mean, this in kind of, if we're kind of handicapping this as a Vance Rubio sort of thing, I feel like Rubio's probably in a better position, but maybe Vance just felt like, well, I need to do something here, and here's my move. I don't know.
I think that's right. Now, what we don't know is how much of that came from Vance and how much of that came from Trump. How much of it came from Rubio? I mean,
Rubio's like, yeah, that sounds like a good idea, JD. Get out in front of this. Exactly. Please do.
So, as you probably, there was, the speculation of, back during the Biden administration, Biden made Kamala Harris border czar, the sort of, geez, thanks. So I don't know. I think it's tough for a president, even Trump, to avoid responsibility in something like this, right? In negotiating the end to a war with a significant foreign adversary, and say, well, geez, that was the vice president's job. It's not as if again, he was named border czar or drug czar or czar of some little policy fiefdom, right? That you can say, well, this isn't something that the president would be doing full time anyway.
Yeah.
But as commander in chief, it sort of is. So I think I think you're right that Trump might try to blame Vance. I don't know how that plays out. But regardless of whether he blames him or not, it still doesn't help J.D. Vance to have his fingerprints all over this.
I think it plays out well, potentially plays out well within the party, because I think what a lot of Republicans who still care about their political careers have learned is that you still have potentially a certain amount to fear from Donald Trump, especially in terms of getting primaried. And so therefore, if we can just express our displeasure with the policy and blame Vance, maybe that's a better way to do it and a safer way politically than to blame Trump.
I don't know about that, because I think Trump's power in primaries, influence in primaries, and we hit on this later in the show, diminishes by the day. And I think that's, it's as soon as I mentioned, I think last time I was on sort of the Donkey Kong analogy, that one board, right, where you got to hop on the elevator that's going up before it can jump it off again before it gets too high. But I think that's the problem that he faces, is that those threats of primaries become increasingly small as time goes on.
Yeah, and certainly I agree with you that they get smaller, though I still think he'll have quite a bit of influence. We'll see. But yeah, the other thing, a couple of the points on the MOU I want to get into. The first one being that Iran pledges to not charge any tolls or fees or whatever you want to call it for the first 60 days. And the first thing I thought about was like, wow, it should be just does not charge any, because a core U.S. point in its strategy in the Middle East since, Reagan and before. I mean, I remember vaguely, a little bit in the 80s, Reagan saying, listen, freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf, that whole area, that is our thing, and we are going to defend that. That is absolutely critical. He was right then. He's right now. And the idea that we would say, well, just don't charge tolls for the next couple of months. And after that, we'll see. That to me is unacceptable.
Yeah, I don't think that would ever really come to pass. I think what would happen is we get to that point and the Iranians say, okay, here's the toll. And I'm not sure exactly how that is supposed to work, the mechanics behind it. Do we just get a bill? But I think we wouldn't pay it. And then we'd be back to, we're going to go through the strait, and Iran saying we're going to close it. So that's sort of one of the things I predicted in our now lost episode, a piece of something that can happen is that they will reclose. They will take some action against American shipping, American interests, or continued action against the Israelis that will make it untenable to say that this deal is still on.
And, it seems to me in the end that what we're trying to do, kind of like even on a larger level, what President Obama tried to do with the JCPOA, essentially there's a negative and a positive way to put it. The positive way is to say, well, we need to give Iran some reason to have buy-in in this, which is pretty difficult once we've, killed a lot of their top leadership and shown we're more than happy to launch these sort of things.
The buy-in is buy-in and you don't get killed.
Well, but clearly that's not, we can degrade them to a certain point, but we're not willing to take those next steps. And as the more hawkish hawks say, finish the job, But it's not necessarily a bad idea on the face. That $300 billion development fund, I don't think it's a crazy idea. Assuming it's all private investors with with no U.S. government money, and depending how it's structured, that sort of thing. The war has cost Iran somewhere between $250 billion in infrastructure losses. So a $300 billion development fund, well, that's a pretty big carrot there. But the problem is something that one of my favorite writers, Nick Toggio from the Dispatch, pointed out. I said, it's the China playbook. We're going to try to de-radicalize a dangerous regime by essentially paying it off and saying we can integrate you into the global economy, right? And so I get that idea. And J.D. Vance said, hey, if they act like a normal country, we'll treat them normally, that sort of thing. But as you pointed out in that lost segment, well, they're not really a normal country, and every president from Carter on has had to learn that fact, and now all of a sudden Donald Trump is, I think, maybe learning that fact.
Yeah, they're not normal. They won't use the money, and I think there's something that I didn't say in the last one, but I think it might be tough to get private investment for this type of thing. You just want to. I think I would classify that investment as rather high risk in seeing one, if the whatever development that you think is going to get built ever actually gets built, and moreover, even if it does, then it doesn't get nationalized immediately. But I think far more likely is the money's just funneled to terrorist proxies. Right? That's what has happened for the last 45 years whenever we have released money to Iran, or that's the money it gets from its oil sales. It's not a normal country. It hasn't been for 45 years. And I don't know, short of regime change, how it becomes a normal country.
Yeah. And I don't know. Again, we don't want to get into psychoanalyzing Donald Trump. That's a rabbit hole to go down. But when Axios talked to him this week, and he asked what he learned about the limits of his power from this war, he said, "I haven't learned that lesson yet. I know there are, but there are no limits." It's like, okay. Now, if Biden said that, would be thinking about cognitive decline, but I guess this is just is it the swerve?
No, I think that's pretty consistent with the way Trump's always viewed himself, as there are no limits. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think so. On this, it seems to me that we both agree that this was a pretty poor deal.
I would say so. And I think that it's not going to hold up, assuming it hasn't already collapsed, even as we speak. One last thing I did want to bring up, this was before we got cut off in the end, is there is something to not blame Trump for all of this entirely, is the American public's appetite and willingness to sacrifice for a war, righteous or not. I think that's something that has changed over time, and I think to some extent Trump still has to read the tea leaves and see, does America really want to make a sacrifice for a freer Middle East? Because I think I've said this before, if there was a regime change in Iran, that's sort of a Berlin Wall moment, right? That's a real changing of the order, and could usher in a huge boost to peace and prosperity in the Middle East if it actually happened. So I think that's a worthy goal.
Yeah, I agree with you. But I think a big problem, of course, is that President Trump didn't bother to make any sort of a case to the American people. Just, Dave, missiles are in the air, and that's not exactly. I recall, and I'm sure you recall, back when we were going to go to war and remove Saddam Hussein from power. I mean, George H.W. Bush had a very, very different approach. And to me, that's the sort of approach that I think, to me, that's still, maybe it's me, an old fogey traditionalist, but that's what you do. You talk to your allies, you build up this sort of international support, you make this case, and then you move.
Yeah. But I was going to say, so this is what struck me a little bit. It's just this weird. So as I sit here in my wood-paneled study, I have some stuff. I know, Mike, and some of our listeners, my mom passed away last year, and I still have lots and lots of stuff that I have to go through and figure out what I'm going to do with, stuff I need to save. One of the things that she saved was her ration stamp book from World War II, when she would have been, I think, probably 6 or 7, depending on the year. And it just struck me that would Americans today be anywhere ready to accept the kind of sacrifices that we did during World War II? And I don't know that we would. Maybe if there was some sort of, again, catastrophic evil regime comparable to the Nazis, but Iran's not too far off, right? I mean, so.
Well, I'll say morally, ethically, I think maybe you can make a case, but in terms of their ability.
Well, in terms of ability, but yeah, I was saying in terms of the moral. If the Iranians could wipe every Jew off the face of the earth, I believe they would.
Yeah, the Revolutionary Guard leadership, absolutely.
Yeah. So, I think, and if you think back, at the time when we entered World War II, we knew the Germans were bad, but at that point, the world didn't really know what was happening in those camps, and that it was a regime bent on genocide. And yet we still made those sacrifices then. And I just don't know if, and maybe I'm wrong, and maybe it's just we're in a position now where, hey, look, the good news is we can go to war, and the worst thing that's going to happen is you're going to have high gas prices for, in this case, it was a couple months. But let's say it's, it goes on a year or two, high gas prices for a couple of years. To me, I think I understand it's a difficult price to pay when you've got midterms coming up. But at the same time, if you want to be remembered in history as someone great who did something great, then you say, look, maybe you need to go to the American people and convince them that the temporary sacrifice is worth the greater freedom, prosperity, peace for everybody that lies down the road. And I don't think Trump has done that or even necessarily thought through how to do that.
Yeah, and I don't even know if he is the person who can do that. It just seems so out of character. He's not Churchillian in any real way of that. So I don't know that he really is even capable of providing that sort of leadership. Okay, so why don't we move on? Certainly we will have a lot more to say about Iran in the weeks and months to come. We'll move on to something a little bit different. It's not often that a U.S. president nominates someone for a position and then tells that person not to attend their confirmation hearing, but that's exactly what President Trump recently did. Last week, Trump announced he was nominating Jay Clayton to serve as Director of National Intelligence, but this week he derailed the confirmation hearing, saying that Clayton can't leave his current position as U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York until the Senate confirms Clayton's replacement. Now, the Senate was hoping to quickly push through Clayton's nomination to prevent Trump's pick for interim DNI FHFA Director Bill Pulte from ever serving in that position. A number of senators on both sides of the aisle really have expressed real concerns about Pulte serving in the DNI role, and Trump naming him interim DNI resulted in the Senate not renewing Section 702 of FISA, which lets the U.S. collect communications of non-U.S. persons abroad without individual warrants, which can incidentally, quote unquote, sweep in Americans' communications. Trump complicated that renewal even more by announcing that he won't approve any renewal of 702 unless it includes the SAVE Act, which would require documentary proof of citizenship to register to vote in federal elections. Senate Republican leadership has reportedly told Trump that they just don't have the votes to pass the SAVE Act, and they appear, I'd say, understandably frustrated at Trump's moves that are blocking Section 702 renewal. So, Jay, I thought we'd start with President Trump's claim that Clayton can't leave his current position as U.S. Attorney until his replacement is confirmed. What do you think's behind that?
Well, I think I'm not entirely clear unless he's sort of maybe elevating this position of this acting U.S. attorney in this district over DNI, which, look, to be fair, there could be an argument there that you and I talked about how necessary is the DNI, how necessary is that agency, but I don't know. It's sort of a weird, again, Trump peak sort of thing, and it's a strange world where one nominates someone and then sort of tries to not to get them confirmed. So I don't know. I mean, I think the popular wisdom was that Jay Clayton was a serious person and someone that everyone felt much more comfortable with than say Bill Pulte at that position, and that there ought to be he ought to be quickly confirmed. So no, I don't pretend to understand what's really behind that piece of this.
Yeah. Well, to me, I guess you should back up with a little bit of history on this. Right in April of last year, the interim SDNI, who was U.S. Attorney, Danielle Sassoon, I think, she resigned after DOJ's order to drop corruption charges against Eric Adams was at a point, mayor, after which then Trump named Clayton as interim U.S. Attorney for SDNY, but because of senatorial courtesy, New York's two Democratic senators effectively have kind of a veto over U.S. attorney picks by just not returning those blue slips. And so under U.S. law, an interim U.S. attorney can serve up to 120 days without confirmation, after which the federal judges in that district can appoint someone to fill the role until there's a Senate-confirmed pick. And that's exactly what they did in August of 2025. And that's how Clayton is in that job. Now, Trump has nominated James McDonald
and Clayton
for the position.
and Trump did not have that. That did not work out for Trump as well in other district courts where he tried to appoint. Yeah,
exactly. And so McDonald, though, actually, you can argue, is more qualified in some ways than Clayton was for the job because he is a former federal prosecutor. Clayton had very limited prosecutorial experience. But also, McDonald previously worked on Trump's criminal defense team, personal attorney, that sort of thing. And so I think the general consensus on McDonald is that he's qualified, but he's too much of a Trump loyalist to easily get through confirmation. And so I got to think that Trump has to know that the Senate's going to have a hard time confirming McDonald, which suggests to me that he'd like Pulte to be acting DNI for an extended period, all the while kind of giving himself the cover saying, hey, I put in my nomination here. And that gives Pulte the ability to come in because he came in to work a day early and said, give me a list of names, people I can fire. And supposedly he's going to fire, 200-300 people, something like that. So it kind of makes sense to me. I feel like he's just trying to give Pulte enough room to do the dirty work before he's gone and Clayton takes over.
Wow. You are crediting Trump with playing 4D chess here, I think.
Maybe that is. I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know that that's... I mean, you could very well be right, but that just seems to me like there's a lot of parts to that Rube Goldberg machine.
Well, maybe you're right. Yeah.
And it's I don't know. Well, like I said, I don't have a good explanation myself, so maybe that explanation works. But again, it's sort of then you. It sort of assumes that Trump would care about the pretense of saying, "Hey, I nominated this really good guy who's not Bill Pulte, but you won't, you won't confirm him." And it's sort of transparent. It was like, well, you told him not to show up, and right. I think Trump, the typical Trump would be like, "Hey, Pulte's my guy. I'm sticking with him until I'm not." So I think that would be an aberration of Trump to say, I'm sticking with Pulte. I'm nominating this guy. Now I'm sticking with, I don't know.
What about Trump's insistence that the SAVE Act, which is obviously entirely unrelated, be tied to 702 renewal? I mean, it's not an uncommon thing. Take something unpopular, tie it to something that's sort of a lot of people see as must pass. All right.
I'll tell you, strategically, I don't see it as being particularly valuable. I mean, I understand, and first of all, if the Senate says they don't have the votes, and they don't have the votes, well, it seems like a particularly bad plan, right? You're holding up everything. You're holding up some important national security legislation renewals, and I'll tell you, I would say the SAVE Act on principle, I think makes a lot of sense. I think there's a good argument about, is this really the federal government's job as opposed to various state governments, which have enacted a lot of its proposals beforehand, right? But I tying in this and making this sort of the hill to die on seems to be a bad plan. I think you're better off trying to get a clean vote on the SAVE Act and let it go down and let Democrats vote against it and say, listen, I tried to safeguard elections and here's what we got, and here's who voted against it, both Democrats and Republicans, right? But
see, to me, it seems like the SAVE Act is ostensibly a vote integrity measure that's actually written to be a vote suppressions or to make it more difficult to vote, I would say, because the core provisions, just for folks who aren't aware, essentially would bar states from registering anyone to vote in a federal election unless they produce in person documentary proof of citizenship at the time of registration. And that proof is fairly narrowly defined. It also applies to anyone who updates their registration if you move or something like that. So what that does is that effectively guts mail and online voter registration, and it didn't have to. And I think that's
right. No, I think you're right that the SAVE Act brings with it. You could it's sort of sloppily written, and then you could ensure the voter integrity stuff you're after without some of the problems that exist in its current version.
Yeah, see, my argument is that it's not sloppily written. It was very purposefully and thoughtfully written to exactly do that. And there are a number of other things as well. Like, for instance, it creates what's called a private right of action, and as well as criminal exposure for election officials. If they register someone without confirming documentation, they can be sued. They can face criminal penalties of up to 5 years in prison, even for unintentional clerical errors, things like that. And so all they would have had to do to kind of limit that to a certain extent would to put the word knowingly into that. If an election official knowingly does, that's a pretty common sort of thing. And so when you look at it as a whole, it's hard not to see it as something that, again, is sort of not just it's not just a solution in search of a problem. That's another aspect, but it's not really designed to, I think, both make elections safer and also to not impose too much of a burden on people, because there's always that tension, but it clearly goes all the way over, I think, far further than it needs to.
Yeah, and look, if we're debating the merits of the SAVE Act, like I said, I think I mentioned a couple minutes, I'm on board with its goals and the general thrust of it. I think you could make it, and again, it's sort of is you got to make up your mind, Mike. Is Donald Trump a complete buffoon or evil genius? It's I think this is just, you write the thing, they're trying to be as tough as they can. And you write these, really tough pieces of legislation. Sometimes I think not to the idea that you're actually going to get them passed, but you're going to make the other side vote against them. And I think you don't want to do with a situation where you create or allow, let's put it this way, allow Democrats to sort of take the soccer flop kind of, oh my gosh, this is preventing all these people, because there will be, right? There's always going to be someone, who is this little old lady who's lived here for 70 years, but can't come up with the right documentation and therefore was prevented from voting and all that sort of thing. So instead of trying to, again, plan ahead to head off some of those horror stories, you seem to be pushing ahead. And I think tying it to the FISA renewal is, again, it's setting aside the policy behind it. I think it's not good political strategy.
Yeah. Well, and it could be something as simple as Donald Trump doesn't actually like FISA. He's had a longstanding grievance against it. I mean, he's argued that it's been one of the things that was used by his enemies to target him.
And it was. Yeah. I mean, to be fair, yes, it was. But I think that's a different argument. And if that's the case, I think
I would say that, as far as I know, we don't actually have evidence that 702 was used to intentionally target Donald Trump. But if evidence is,
Carter Page would beg to differ. But
anyway, I should also point out that this isn't a real expiration. I was maybe a little unclear on this when I talked about it last week or 2 weeks ago, but here's how it works. The FISA Amendments Act has a transition provision. So any data acquisition that's approved by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court before the statute lapses continues until that certification expires. So how it works in practice, essentially, is that every year the Attorney General and DNI submit certifications to the FISA court. And those certifications focus on sort of broad categories and methods, not individual surveillance requests, and those last typically for a year. So the real deadline, because the most recent annual certification was March of this year. So the real deadline is kind of March of 2027. So it's sort of a fake deadline here. There's not as much at stake here as maybe some people have made it out to be.
Well, I agree in part, but there's still the sense of you're not going to be able to open new FISA investigations.
Well, and that's the thing is they're done, but they're done as a block. They ask for that. They ask for the permissions all at once a year. They put that together, package it together. So that's done for this year. So as long as it's renewed before March of, early next year, then it's not really going to have any material effect.
Right. Unless whatever we were looking for wasn't in the original package that we passed this year or for 2025 was already authorized.
Right. But
I'm saying if something comes up that you say, hey, we need a new authorization beyond what has already been authorized for this year, that's a problem. Yeah.
But typically it's just one kind of blanket thing, beginning of the year, they do them, they get them, and they're good to go, essentially. So, yeah. And so, I mean, I don't know.
But look, here's the way it's still bad political strategy in terms of if something happens, a terrorist attack on the United States, and it's not like we'd have any reason to have terrorists angry with us at this point in time, or any reason to suspect that a terrorist attack might be coming. And it happens, Democrats have the wide open hole to say, listen, we couldn't get this information because this wasn't reapproved. Now, whether that's true or not, but that's the politics of it.
Yeah.
right? You can say, listen, Republicans derailed our national security in order to insist upon this voter bill that is I don't know. I mean, they would say racist, etc. I would say more, needlessly complicated
and also some
in some
might
cases
say
unneeded. But
yeah, some might call it a solution in search of a problem. I mean, in terms of non-citizen voting, based on any evidence that we can find, including from conservative groups. I mean, the Heritage Foundation has a voter fraud database, and in all elections, all federal elections between 1999 and 2023, that's quite a lot of elections, a lot of votes. There have only been 77 instances of non-citizen voting. And so, I mean, we're talking about basically, when I did the stats, around a 1 in a million probability. To put it in context, 65 times less likely than being struck by lightning in your lifetime, apparently. So, I mean, this is the sort of thing where I think a traditional conservative would say, wait a second, do we need government to solve problems that don't necessarily exist? And if we do, should the federal government be solving a problem that doesn't exist for all the states, or should we just let the states handle it?
Well, and that's sort of where the classical conservative position would be, I think,
exactly.
Right? And like I said, in a lot of states, there's already these kind of processes in place. I think it's sort of a weird, so what I'm trying to say is I think the goals of the bill are correct. And you and I have had these sort of discussions before about, well, just because they haven't caught a lot of people doing it doesn't mean there's not value in taking steps to deter it. One, because we may be underreporting the number of times this has happened, just because if they, someone got away with it, then we by necessity don't know that they got away with it. Even so, I would tend to agree with you. The number of non-citizens voting is rounding error type material, right? It's not going to sway any significant election. If it were to boost numbers, say in a presidential election, it wouldn't matter because those are blue states anyway, most likely, where you'd have that extra run up. So no, I would put it this way: you say it's a problem in search of a solution in search of a problem. I think it is perhaps a problem, but a lower priority problem than FISA renewal.
Yeah, I would say it's,
and therefore you shouldn't sacrifice the one to the other.
Yeah, that makes sense. Absolutely. All right. Well, let's move on to some elections, Jay, because this week we saw primaries in Georgia, Alabama, and Oklahoma. And in Georgia, Congressman Mike Collins, who Trump endorsed 2 days before the vote, he won the Republican Senate nomination. He's going to face the Democratic incumbent Jon Ossoff. But for governor, Trump's endorsee, Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, lost to billionaire healthcare executive Rick Jackson. In Alabama, Trump-backed Barry Moore won the Senate runoff and will go up against attorney Everett West. And in Oklahoma, Trump endorsee Kevin Hern won the Republican Senate primary for the seat that opened up when Trump chose Markwayne Mullin to head DHS. Now, Hern's Democratic opponent will be determined after a runoff on August 25th between Nikala Jasmine Thomas and Jim Priest, who happens to be an ordained minister. Hard not to see that one coming, right. But anyway. Now, neither of those races is expected to be competitive. And so, I don't know, I thought we maybe start with the Georgia Senate race. It seems to me that Democrats got the race and the opponent that they wanted there. What do you think?
Oh, I think that's probably right. But I think Georgia shows sort of a situation where Trump's endorsement matters, but may not be the end-all, be-all for this. And to say, well, if someone was endorsed 2 days before the election, that doesn't give you a lot of momentum, right? That doesn't. I don't think a endorsement 2 days before your primary drives people to the polls, right? You don't have time to get the mail out on that. I get we can send, you can do things electronically and social media and texting and so forth, saying no, he's been endorsed. But to some extent, also being endorsed 2 days before the election is a little bit of a backhanded compliment. I wasn't sure up until now, or this wasn't a high enough priority for me till now, until someone finally reminded me, it's in 2 days. We haven't endorsed yet. It's like, oh, crap, that's Tuesday. So I don't know that it did that much. And I think those races might just kind of be, won or lost on their merits.
Yeah. Well,
Setting all aside, I think it's still better to be endorsed by Trump than not to be endorsed by Trump in a Republican primary. But as time goes on, it's the enthusiasm and the potency of that endorsement, I think, is going to wane.
Well, I think he waits oftentimes in part just to kind of see, how things are going and that sort of thing, and kind of tries to pick who's going to be the winner anyway. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But the governor race thing was weird because, like I said, Rick Jackson is a billionaire, and he spent over $108 million, and a lot of it was his own money. And to give you a sense, I did the numbers, that's roughly $289 per vote he received. And as best I can tell, that's a lot. That's the second highest total ever on a per vote basis for a statewide race. And it's not like he's anti-Trump either. I mean, he donated $1 million to a pro-Trump super PAC before he launched his bid for governor. He's had dinner with Trump at Mar-a-Lago. So it's not like he's some, radical anti-Trumper sort of person.
Right. He just wasn't his chosen.
But in the Senate race, I think Collins is clearly more hardline MAGA than Dooley. And in fact, that's what Brian Kemp was trying to argue, is like he's much more electable. I mean, Collins has a voting record that Democrats can attack. Dooley was a first-time college football coach, first-time candidate. And also, there's an ongoing House Ethics Committee investigation against him, really kind of against his staff. But, so yeah, exactly.
My kind of guy.
Well, apparently his then chief of staff gave a no-show job to his girlfriend, and the chief of staff is gone. I don't know if the girlfriend's gone or anything like that, but you know how that is. And also, Ossoff's a really good fundraiser. I mean, he's raised something like $60 million. He's got over $30 million in the bank. Collins doesn't have as much. And of course, Ossoff was run unopposed, and Republicans spent a lot of time kind of knocking each other around and so forth. So that's almost always a positive thing, especially in what's likely to be the toughest seat for Democrats to hold in this election.
Yeah. No, I think that is all probably right. Yeah.
All right. Well, gosh, that is all probably right. Sounds like a good place for me to stop, unless you have any other thoughts on this.
No, not particularly, other than I think, I want to put like a marker on this, right? And because this is, I think, how things will evolve, is that the Trump nomination will matter, but it will matter in decreasing importance as time moves on.
Well, I think that's probably right. Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on to something truly weird. On June 14th, that was Flag Day, as well as President Trump's 80th birthday, the UFC staged a live MMA card on the South Lawn of the White House, an event that was branded UFC Freedom 250 and pitched as a sort of a kickoff to America's 250th anniversary celebration. Now, 2 days later, the Justice Department unsealed charges against 5 men for an alleged plot to attack that event with explosive-laden drones and snipers. Now, underneath the whole spectacle of all this, I think at least 2 things worth bringing up. First is the legality of the UFC event. 2 plaintiffs sued to try to stop it from going forward. A federal judge declined to do so. He said, well, number one, they lacked standing, and also they'd waited too long, but he did not, of course, reach the merits on that. It was just
right. And now it's moot.
Yeah. Now, the second thing, though, I think is an institutional question, in a sense, because there are now sort of 2 organizations sort of ostensibly running 250th birthday celebration. The first one, America 250, was created by Congress in 2016 and is kind of a standard bipartisan-ish sort of thing. The other, Freedom 250, was created by an executive order in the Trump administration's first weeks, and it's kind of running these marquee Washington events, including the UFC thing. And it's a lot more political, safe to say, and recent polling suggests that a majority of Americans, including half of Republicans, now think that the 250th birthday celebration has already grown too political. So I guess on the thwarted plot part of things, Jay, I don't have much to say aside from the fact that I'm glad it was thwarted.
Yeah, I'm all for thwarting plots.
Any other thoughts on that?
No, other than, look, congratulations to the law enforcement and intelligence people who stopped it. I think that's a very good thing. And I don't know if there's anything more to say about that. On the UFC thing in particular, and this goes more to the aesthetics of it, I suppose, than any legalities or politics. But maybe it goes to politics. my initial reaction, I suppose it's still my reaction, is that is sort of a God, that's tacky, right? Right, and that's what a lot of people have thought, that this is sort of a just silly and demeaning, and this is the White House lawn. But at the same time, I'm as you know, Mike, I'm a student of history.
Yeah, sure.
Particularly interest to me is early America and the Revolutionary period. And something struck me the other day as I was thinking about this, that our forefathers, in some ways, sometimes we think of them as these guys in wigs and silk stockings and, standing up making eloquent speeches. But in the early days of the Revolution, particularly in Boston, these were a bunch of drunk brawlers, right? These were guys. I recently read, and I recommend this to everybody, and Mike, I'm sending you a copy, actually, of Rick Atkinson's The British Are Coming, which is the best written, most fun read of the American Revolution. This is just part one of three. But anyway, throughout this, Atkinson sort of makes the point, a lot of these folks were pretty... I'm trying to think, is the way he puts it, we're not gentle people. And I sort of think that in some respects, the guys who met, the Sons of Liberty and people who dressed up like Indians and threw tea off boats and tarred and feathered royal people, smashed the governor's mansion in Boston, and something that was more January 6th than January 6th, would have appreciated the MMA fight on the lawn, even if sort of maybe the Adams, the other Adams, Johns and Jefferson and some of your more high-minded patriots would have looked askance at it. So I'm a little bit torn in that. One, I think it's tacky, but you know what? I think there is something that kind of does get to the perhaps true American spirit in that just all-out brawling. So
yeah, I'm with you on that, because when I took a look at the legal issues and the case that's made, it seems to me that it probably is most likely legal, but yeah, like you said, super tacky. To me, it's very unbecoming what I feel should be the dignity of the presidency and the White House and that. But like you said, but then again, I realize that that's me coming from sort of a I
you
joke
and your
with you
ivory tower, yeah.
Well, you're much more of a cultural elite than I am. You can tell Shostakovich from Stravinsky, and to me, it's just I don't know. But the point is that this seems to resonate with a lot of people. I find it to be just not good at all. But in terms of legal, yeah. Now, I think on the plot, the one thing I'll say is that it seems like the plotters had a really good plan, but didn't have the resources to kind of carry it off. And it sounded like they were kind of, they were concerned about the Epstein thing, and they were concerned apparently about going after strong supporters of Israel. So it wasn't like a crazy woke.
There's kind of a lot. There's kind of a lot going on there. I'm concerned about the Epstein thing. I'm going to bomb the MMA fight.
Well, that's kind of how it works. But yeah, it's sort of. But in a way, I think people, we look back at to the extent that people look back at the 200th anniversary celebration and say, well, that wasn't political. A tall ship's a beautiful thing and all that. If you actually look back at the history, no, it actually was fairly political, especially for the times. It's hard to see how that wouldn't be the case. And certainly with Donald Trump as president, I didn't think there'd be any way this could be anything but sort of a hyper politicized sort of thing is my take.
Well, I think something else is when we say political, because political can mean two things. I can certainly see you have celebrations, observations that are inherently political, and to some extent, look, as a conservative, I almost sort of read this into this. If any time of we're looking back at founding fathers of what they were doing in the beginnings of this country, because there's such a push on the progressive left to sort of get rid of that, right? It's sort of inherently political, just the medium is the message almost sort of thing. But in this case, it's not just that sort of political. It's and I don't even say partisan, because it's just Trump, right? The Trump aggrandizement, which again, I think comes off as tacky. Say what you will about Gerald Ford. He was not, you didn't have the same sort of personality. The 1976 bicentennial was not seen as a general aggrandizement of President Ford. So
there we go.
And I think, I should, because again, we were both around for that. And
not that we were really aware in any.
Oh, I was aware. I had our elementary school, we had these tote bags. Back in the day, people, we didn't have backpacks. They evidently hadn't been invented yet or whatever. But in 1976, if you were in elementary school, you carried your stuff in a tote bag, which was this little, bag and a little thing. And on the cover of it, we had the Spirit of 76, painting, the guy with the flag and the fife and the drum.
Oh, sure.
And I don't see that around these days, and I think that's a shame. And I wish I still had that tote bag, but
you do have skull-crushing, arm-breaking MA action. So there you go. What could be more American than that? Anyway. Yeah. Well, on that note, we will close out this week's episode. And hey, if anything we discussed made a big impression, loved it, hated it, just wonder what the heck we were talking about, we would love to hear from you. You can email us, mail@politicsguys.com, or reach out through Facebook, X, or our supporters Discord. And as always, all the links are in the show notes, and I am on our Discord all the time. And if you're getting value from this show and want to support what we do, the best way to do that is through Patreon. You can even start with a free trial. All supporters get ad-free episodes, the full midweek show instead of just the preview, and access to the Discord with even more benefits at higher levels of support. And if Patreon isn't your thing, not a problem. We also have PayPal and Venmo with all those links in the show notes, as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And if you want to get those full midweek episodes, but you can't support us financially right now, not a problem. Email me at mike@politicsguys.com and I will get that set up for you. Whether you support us or not, it is a big help if you can subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you listen, as well as sharing episodes. And finally, as always, before we go, a very special thanks to our wonderful executive producing team, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, Jody Marie Miller, and Sean Fugate. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,